In 1887, a young anthropologist entered the mountains of western North Carolina with a notebook. He wasn't looking for buried treasure, he wasn't searching for monsters, and he certainly wasn't expecting to hear stories about people who were said to live inside the mountains. His name was James Mooney. Mooney was working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, an institution connected to the Smithsonian. His job was to document the traditions, beliefs, language, and history of Native communities before more of their knowledge disappeared. But when Mooney began speaking with Cherokee elders, he encountered something that would stay in his records for more than a century. The Cherokee told him about a people known as the Nunnehi. They were not simply ghosts. They were not gods. They were described as another kind of people, beings associated with particular places in the mountains, capable of appearing and disappearing, and in some traditions, living beneath or within the landscape itself. And then came an even stranger story. At a Cherokee settlement called Nikwasi, when the community was threatened by an enemy force, help was said to have come from beneath the earth. The story involved a mound, an opening, and warriors who emerged from it. Mooney didn't write the story as a modern horror writer would. He didn't add monsters. He didn't tell his readers what they were supposed to believe. He simply recorded what his Cherokee informants told him. And that is what makes the story so fascinating. Because more than 130 years later, the mountains are still there, the mound is still there, and Mooney's record is still there. So what exactly did James Mooney discover in Cherokee country in 1887? And how much of the story belongs to documented Cherokee tradition? And how much was added later? Let's go back to the beginning. The story begins with James Mooney. In the late 19th century, American institutions were becoming increasingly interested in documenting Native American cultures. But there was a problem. Much of the knowledge existed orally. It lived in stories, in ceremonies, in place names, in memories passed from one generation to another. And as Native communities faced removal, assimilation, and enormous political pressure, researchers feared that some of this knowledge would disappear. Mooney approached his work differently from many outsiders of his time. He spent years working with Native communities. He learned languages. He listened to elders. And rather than simply collecting strange stories, he tried to understand the cultural system behind them. In Cherokee country, this meant listening to people who carried traditions that had survived enormous historical upheaval. The Cherokee had already experienced one of the most devastating episodes in their history. The forced removal of thousands of Cherokee people in the 1830s became known as the Trail of Tears. Families were separated, communities were disrupted, and people were moved thousands of miles away from their ancestral homeland. But not everyone left. The ancestors of today's eastern band of Cherokee Indians remained in the mountains of North Carolina, and it was among these communities that Mooney conducted some of his most important work. He listened to people who knew the mountains not simply as scenery, but as a landscape filled with names, stories, sacred places, dangers, and memories. One of the traditions he recorded concerned the Nunnehi, and this is where the story becomes very different from the typical ghost story. The Cherokee description didn't fit neatly into the modern idea of a ghost. The Nunnehi were described as a supernatural or spirit people, but they were also portrayed in human-like terms. They could have communities, they could have leaders, they could hold dances, they could interact with humans, and, most importantly, they were associated with particular places. The mountains weren't simply where the stories happened. The mountains were part of the story. Some traditions placed the Nunnehi beneath or within mountains. Travelers could reportedly hear music or voices coming from places where no visible settlement existed. From the outside, there was only rock. But according to the tradition, another world existed beyond what human eyes could see. And one particular story made this idea even more dramatic. It involved Nikwasi. Today, Franklin, North Carolina is a modern town. Roads pass through it. Buildings surround it. Cars move through the streets. But beneath the modern landscape is an ancient earthwork known as Nikwasi Mound. For the Cherokee, Nikwasi was not simply a pile of earth. It was connected to an old Cherokee settlement and a much deeper cultural history. And in the traditions recorded by Mooney, the mound became part of a remarkable story. Imagine the scene. A Cherokee community is threatened by an enemy. The defenders are badly outnumbered. The situation looks hopeless. Then, a stranger appears. He tells the people not to continue the fight. Instead, they are instructed to withdraw. Something else will defend them. And then comes the extraordinary part. According to the tradition Mooney recorded, the mound itself becomes the source of the defenders. The Nunnehi emerge. They are armed, they are numerous, and they drive the enemy away. When the battle is finished, the mysterious warriors return. They disappear back into the mound, and the opening closes. Now, we have to pause here, because there are two different ways to tell this story. One way is to say, this proves that an underground civilization existed beneath Nikwasi. But Mooney's work does not prove that. The other way is to dismiss it completely as meaningless superstition. That also misses something important. What Mooney actually documented was that this story existed within Cherokee oral tradition. That is historically significant by itself. The value of Mooney's record is not that it proves every supernatural event happened exactly as described. Its value is that it preserves what Cherokee people were saying about their own history, landscape, and spiritual world at a particular moment in time. And this distinction matters, because the question isn't simply, did warriors literally come out of the mound? The deeper historical question is, why was this mound connected to stories about supernatural defenders? Why Nikwasi? Why this particular place? Why did the Cherokee tradition place powerful beings beneath the landscape? And why did similar stories appear in connection with other mountains? Mooney recorded traditions concerning places such as Pilot Knob and Blood Mountain as well. The pattern is striking. The mountains were not empty spaces. They were inhabited by memory. And in Cherokee tradition, sometimes they were inhabited by beings. But there was another mystery waiting for Mooney, one that had nothing to do with a mound. It had to do with the mountains themselves. If you travel through the southern Appalachian Mountains, something unusual appears above the forest. On certain high peaks, instead of seeing continuous trees, you find open, grassy areas. These are known as mountain balds. They can look almost unnatural. A forest surrounds them. Then, suddenly, the trees stop, and beyond them is open grass. For generations, scientists, historians, and local communities have debated how these landscapes developed. There isn't one simple explanation that applies equally to every bald. Climate changed. Fire affected Appalachian landscapes. Animals grazed. Humans altered mountain environments. And vegetation naturally changes over time. But the mystery surrounding the balds created something else. Stories. Local traditions connected some mountain openings with older memories and warnings. And this is where modern versions of the Cherokee mystery become much more dramatic than Mooney's original material. You will sometimes hear claims that Cherokee people deliberately cleared 7 mountain summits to watch for creatures emerging from underground. You may hear stories about sealed shafts beneath the mountains, or hidden chambers, or surveyors who supposedly discovered structures and then watched their reports disappear. These stories are fascinating, but there is an important problem. They should not automatically be presented as something James Mooney documented in 1887. There is no good reason to merge every later Appalachian mystery into Mooney's original fieldwork. That's exactly how historical stories become distorted. And if we're going to investigate what James Mooney actually discovered, we have to separate 3 things: what Mooney recorded, what later storytellers claimed, and what modern researchers can actually verify. That distinction makes the story more interesting, not less. Because even without the later legends, Cherokee traditions about the mountains are extraordinary. The landscape itself carried meaning. Certain locations had stories attached to them. Some places were associated with supernatural beings. Some were dangerous. Others were places where humans and the spirit world were believed to interact. And the Nunnehi were not simply random monsters hiding in caves. They were part of a larger worldview, a world in which the visible landscape could contain an invisible dimension. That brings us to another fascinating part of Mooney's research. He wasn't only recording stories about beings beneath the earth. He also documented Cherokee traditions involving strange beings and unusual events in the sky. But once again, we need to be careful. Modern internet stories often connect everything together: underground beings, mountain chambers, strange lights, ancient structures, and government investigations. Mooney himself did not necessarily present all of these things as one unified mystery. That connection is largely a modern interpretation. And this is where the real investigation begins. Because Mooney's greatest discovery may not have been finding an answer. It may have been preserving a question. Think about the world Mooney entered in the 1880s. There were no smartphones, no drones, no satellite images, no modern national parks protecting every historic location. No easy way to compare one community's traditions with another's. Mooney had something much more valuable. He had access to people who remembered. People who could explain the meaning of names. People who could describe places their grandparents had known. People who understood stories as part of a living cultural system. And Mooney wrote these things down. That record became part of a much larger government publication on Cherokee traditions. Today, people sometimes approach these records looking for proof of monsters, lost civilizations, or hidden underground worlds. But the historical record offers something more complicated. It shows us how the Cherokee understood their world. The Nunnehi were not simply creatures hiding underground for a modern audience to discover. They belonged to a cultural universe in which humans, spirits, animals, mountains, rivers, and sacred places were connected. And Nikwasi wasn't simply a mysterious mound. It was part of a Cherokee landscape with a history stretching far beyond the 19th century. This is why Mooney's work remains valuable. He didn't need to prove the stories. He preserved them. And preservation matters. Because much of the knowledge he collected existed in oral form. Once a storyteller died, an entire chain of memory could disappear with them. Mooney's notebooks and publications created a written record that could survive. But there's an irony here. The record survived. The landscape survived. The mound survived. Yet the world that gave those stories their full meaning was changed forever. Today, visitors can stand near Nikwasi Mound. They can see the modern town around it. They can look at the earthwork and imagine the Cherokee settlement that once occupied the surrounding landscape. But they cannot simply look at the mound and see what the people of the 19th century saw. That world has to be reconstructed through history. And this is where James Mooney becomes important again. He gives us a rare window into that world. Not because everything he recorded can be scientifically proven, but because he recorded what people believed, remembered, feared, and respected. And sometimes that is more valuable than a sensational answer. Because the biggest mystery isn't necessarily, are the Nunnehi still living inside the mountains? The bigger mystery is, how much knowledge about the mountains disappeared before anyone ever wrote it down? Imagine how many stories were never recorded. How many names were forgotten? How many places lost their meaning? How many elders died without ever being interviewed? And how much of Cherokee knowledge may have existed only in memory? Mooney arrived at a particular moment in history, late enough to record traditions that had survived generations, but early enough to hear them directly from people whose connection to the old Cherokee world was still strong. That makes his 1887 fieldwork extraordinary. Not because it proves an underground civilization, not because it proves supernatural beings are physically hiding beneath the Smokies, but because it captures a moment when an ancient oral tradition was being transferred into a permanent written record. And that record gives us something modern technology cannot manufacture. A voice from the past. A voice describing mountains not as empty wilderness, but as a living landscape filled with stories. More than a century has passed since James Mooney entered Cherokee country. The forests have changed, the towns have changed, the roads have changed. The technology has changed, but the mountains remain. Nikwasi Mound remains, and the stories remain in the historical record. The Nunnehi still appear in the traditions Mooney preserved. They still occupy that strange space between mythology, spirituality, history, and memory. Maybe they were never meant to be understood as literal underground people. Maybe the stories represent something deeper about how the Cherokee understood the relationship between humans and the landscape. Or maybe there are parts of these traditions that we still don't fully understand. What we can say with confidence is that James Mooney heard these stories in Cherokee country and considered them important enough to preserve. And that is the real discovery. Not a hidden door, not a secret government file, not a monster waiting beneath a mountain, but evidence that an entire worldview survived through generations, and that someone in 1887 sat down and listened. So the next time you look at the Smoky Mountains, don't see only trees and ridges. Remember that beneath those mountains are layers of history. Some are archaeological, some are documented, some survive through oral tradition, and some questions remain unanswered. James Mooney came looking for stories. He left behind a record, and more than 100 years later, that record still leaves us with one question: how much of the Cherokee world is still waiting to be understood?